Florida. Believe it or not, this is marks 20 years here, and the 8th year of the capitalism course sponsored by our good friends at BB&T. I'd like to welcome our distinguished panelists who made the trek to Gainesville. It's easy for all of you now, but the first time to Gainesville is always an interesting trip. I'd like to recognize visitors who are here, MBAs, other interested parties, and particularly my class, Capitalism. Acknowledge your robust participation in the 6 sessions we've had. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Kelly Herring and Dave Brown, who supported me. I run this course out of a suitcase from Miami, and without their guidance, their help, and their support, I simply couldn't do it. So, again, David, Kelly, thanks very much. Okay, we're going back to 1701, on the shores of the Detroit River. The explorer Antoine Cadillac founded Fort Pontchartrain. Detroit became an iconic American city, known for robust manufacturing, excellence, and during World War II, it was truly the center of what was called the arsenal of democracy. For many years, it had a racially diverse population. Today, it's engaged in epic struggle for decency and survival. The story of how all this came to pass is why we're here today. Tradition has it in the capitalism course, the first thing we do is pass a hat around with numbers in it, and some of you participated in that game. And the lucky winners or losers, however you look at it, 2 of them get to prepare the case. The rest of the students write a term paper on the same subject. So we've got a lot of experts sitting here in the front row for a change, or the second row, to help out. And please feel free to ask questions at any time, but just raise your hand. We've got a microphone. If any of you ever watch any C-SPAN stuff, wait for the microphone to come to you. The winners of this year's competition, Shelby Gilmore, Kyle Weiss. They worked very hard. I'm proud of their efforts. Gentlemen, showtime.
Thanks again, everybody, for coming. My name is Shelby Gilmore.
And I'm Kyle Weiss. A focal point of many American cities in the early 1900s is a central train station like you can see here in Detroit. It's a symbol of civic pride. You can see what that civic pride looks like in 1913, and you can see what that civic pride looks like 100 years later, in 2013.
Detroit was a bustling manufacturing city throughout the majority of the 20th century, with a vibrant culture centered around Motown music and the diversity of its population. So let's go back in time.
From Michigan's motor town, the Detroit sound.
Detroit's always been a blue-collar town. The first thing that happened, of course, was Henry Ford. He started getting into mass production, and so you had different cultures from everywhere coming up to work in those assembly lines.
Well, it's a manufacturing city. Cars didn't make Detroit, Detroit made the cars.
Something happened in the manufacturing process in Detroit, and that production line that you just saw started to slow at a rapid pace. Here's the story of Detroit in a nutshell for you to read.
This was a difficult and painful decision, but I believe there were no other viable options. From a financial point of view, let me be blunt. Detroit's broke.
In some neighborhoods of Detroit, it looks like a hurricane has recently swept through, destroying nearly everything in its path. And in a sense, that's exactly what has happened here. Only this disaster is an economic one. The US recession has hit Detroit so badly that thousands of houses are being left to rot as residents default on their mortgages, are forced from their homes and move away.
This particular house is at $50 right now. We're starting to see a lot of houses fall well below $1,000. Prices of $500 or less are commonplace.
We've got 78,000 vacant homes in the city of Detroit. We've got about 35,000 homes that need to be demolished and taken down.
Today, Archer points to turnaround efforts ultimately depending on two things.
Two principal sources of money: income tax, property tax.
I really didn't want to go in this direction, but now that we are here, we have to make the best of it.
As you can see, the polarity between 1950s Detroit and present-day Detroit is obvious and it's devastating. And the numbers really don't lie. In the 1950s, you got people flocking to the city of Detroit for the automobile industry. It was the American dream. It slowly dwindled. The 1.85 million has slowly dwindled to a mere 700,000 people in the city of Detroit. 57 years, and you got revenue at a low point right here. 3 times less than it was in the 1970s. You've got the debt trending in the opposite direction right here. It's just unsustainable for the city. But in the early 2000s, Wall Street's still bullish on the city of Detroit. So what exactly happened? Well, this is what happened, and this is the bottom line. Less people in Detroit means less taxes. Less taxes means less public services. Less public services means less people. Less people means less taxes. It's a vicious cycle that turned into a death spiral for the city of Detroit. And this is where that movie ends. Bankruptcy.
So what is Detroit doing today post-bankruptcy? They put into effect a $1.4 billion reinvestment plan over the next 10 years, focusing primarily on blight remediation and improvement of public services and public safety. The largest area of allocated funding was for blight remediation, which refers to the citywide effort to reduce uninhabited residential properties and unused commercial structures. The process starts by targeting homes for demolition. The city then seizes those homes and auctions them off to new owners who will remediate and move on to the land. Public services are another incredibly important aspect of the 10-year plan. Pre-bankruptcy, 40% of Detroit's 88,000 streetlights were inoperable. It was commonplace to wait over an hour and a half for public transportation, and even the most essential of municipal services like police, fire, and EMS were understaffed and inefficient. Detroit successfully exited bankruptcy with half the amount of fixed costs it had in the years leading up to bankruptcy. Detroit's revenues, especially in the short term, will be subject to much volatility, so it is imperative that they reduce costs in order to free up cash flow to help aid with the recovery effort. Finding the right people to manage and lead the city is more than necessary for a successful implementation of the recovery plan. Detroit has successfully brought in a number of experts from around the country to join the administration responsible for overseeing the recovery effort. The state of Michigan will also be directly involved until Detroit shows significant signs of economic improvement. The 10-year plan has looked more than promising over the past year since Detroit exited bankruptcy in 2014.
America's obsession with sports and winning can contain within it some very powerful and applicable metaphors. So to wrap up our brief introduction, we wanted to include a quote from the legendary Chuck Daly, former coach of the Detroit Pistons with the Bad Boys. And it says, "There's nothing like being involved in a team that can go the distance."
So the question remains, can Detroit's new management go the distance and successfully target its goals set forth in this 10-year plan? We will now turn it over to Matthew Dolan, a reporter in the Detroit Bureau of the Wall Street Journal, who will be moderating today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was a great overview. Excuse me. I'm Matt Dolan. I'm a staff reporter with the Wall Street Journal in our Detroit bureau. I've been lucky enough to have a ringside seat in Detroit over the last 8 years. I originally started covering the auto industry, so I watched the transformation of GM and Chrysler and Ford, and then switched over to our national staff and covered the financial decline, and then bankruptcy, and now exit in the city of Detroit. This morning we have a great panel for you because they represent a lot of different constituencies and interests in the city, both public sector and private sector, those who were elected to office, those who are thinking about public policy in a broad way, and also in a very specific way about the lives of people in Detroit. I thought I'd start this morning by introducing everyone on the panel and then starting with an introduction question, and then we'll go from there. I'm happy to take questions, so just let me know when you want to jump in, and we want this to, I think, to be as interactive a process as possible. To my far right is former Mayor Dennis Archer. To my immediate right is James Doak, investment banker with Miller Buckfire, who helped the city really as far back as 2010, but immediately involved in the bankruptcy process, hired as a consultant by the city. To my immediate left is Santil Jenkins, former city council president during the time of both the consent order, which was the state's initial takeover or power sharing agreement with the city, through the bankruptcy. And to my far left is Garrett Mitchell. He's a former Colorado cabinet member and Denver mayoral candidate. And today he's in Washington writing his own newsletter and website, thinking about some of the larger political issues, public policy issues that not only came up in Detroit, but could be happening in other states and other cities around the country. So I thought I'd start with the mayor. We had talked earlier, and part of our presentation this morning was a focus on history, but Mayor, you were part of that history, so I think that you could offer a unique perspective about what happened in Detroit in the decades before we reached a Chapter 9 filing in 2013. I think what's of particular interest to a lot of folks is the enormous success that Detroit had in the middle of the century, but followed by a long period of decline for a number of different reasons, starting in the 1950s. Can you walk us through what it was like in Detroit in that post-1950 period as a number of factors started to go south?
Detroit's population was at its highest point in 1952-53. We had about 1.82 million people living in the city of Detroit. So, as we've seen today when Shelby and Kyle made note of the fact that there's just over 700,000 people living in the city of Detroit. And as you, I'm sure, was watching the homes that were in the process of being destroyed, run down, etc., it should not come as a surprise, because since 1954, people started leaving the city of Detroit. Every decade, people, and every year, people were leaving the city of Detroit for various reasons. When you move fast forward from 1954 until where we are today, the city of Detroit lost 60% of its population. When you consider the loss of population, there's no need for the housing stock that was there for 1.82 million people. And when there are no people living in those houses, I don't think anybody would be surprised that there would be houses run down and people would strip the houses and they would be vacant, etc. So it should not be a surprise that when you drive through the city, you would see all of the vacant land today where there used to be homes and people living and children running and playing and schools all over the place and people working. Well, when faced with that, and when you start thinking about the dreaded word bankruptcy that Detroit has just gone through, and it's not fun being in a barrel where everybody has something to say about your city or your hometown. Let me make this observation and I'll come back to it. The city of Detroit is on its way back. You're in business school, you have an interest in what occurs, whether you're going to go into the world of investment banking or you want to do something with the education that you're receiving here at this outstanding university and in this business school complex. if I were sitting where you were sitting, and I had an interest in making money and doing something significant, I would move to the city of Detroit and take advantage of the opportunity. Here's what I mean. How many of you have ever been to New York? Raise your hands. How many of you are aware that the city of New York was on the verge of bankruptcy in 1975? And they really needed some money. They needed about $2.4 billion. Difference in timing. Congress, led by the President of the United States at that time, Gerald Ford, loaned the city of New York the $2.4 billion that it needed, put in financial institution, financial safeguards where they were going to watch the budget, etc. And you would never know that New York was on the verge of bankruptcy as you see it today. What I'm suggesting is, as we move forward in time, you're going to find the same thing happening as it relates to the city of Detroit. Will we go back to be 1.82 million, 1.82 million people? I'd rather doubt it. But it will be one of the best cities that you will ever want to invest in, see, and grow a family and watch it grow from where we were. Bankruptcy. There were about 364 cases filed in bankruptcy under Chapter 9, starting back in 1954 to where we are today. Out of those 364 cases, only 64 of them had to do with municipal or county bankruptcy. In many of those cases, by the way, the bankruptcy judge said, no, you don't qualify, and it never entered into. So when you hear bankruptcy, you wonder what it's all that mean. It means, at the end of the day, when Mayor Bing came in the office, that he had a $315 million deficit, despite the fact that the city of Detroit and the city council and the governor's office had a consent agreement, because the governor did not want to have the city of Detroit to go into bankruptcy. He wanted to avoid it, wanted to even avoid having an emergency financial manager appointed. He did everything humanly possible to try to make, but it didn't happen. So they had no choice, so they entered into bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is the best thing that could have happened to the city of Detroit, given the fact that the one thing that was abundantly clear, as declared by Mayor Bing and also agreed upon by City Council, the city of Detroit was going to run out of cash money. It could not pay its debts. And what that meant was, when Mayor Bing inherited the $315 million deficit, and was going to run out of cash, there were a number of bonds that were existing, that were, many of them were coming due, that you had to pay. They had no money to pay. So the $18 billion of debt that was there in terms of bond, that was not the deficit, but they were going to have to pay it. And if you didn't pay it, then they could declare you into bankruptcy. So that's why they went. Now, briefly, the city of Detroit, back in the 1960s under Mayor Jerome Kavanaugh, Mayor Jerome Kavanaugh was the first person to ask for an income tax in the city of Detroit. Move fast forward, Mayor Coleman Young went to the legislature and got permission to increase the income tax so that they would have money. Saw a headline in a newspaper back when Mayor Young was in office, it was in the 70s. He was testifying before the Senate committee, I think the Senate committee, along with others who were leaders of the U.S. Council of Mayors, and said, if we don't get any help coming from the federal government, Detroit is subject to be in bankruptcy. We're looking at a $43 million deficit. It could balloon to 83. We're going to have a problem. We need help. They managed to get through it by raising income tax and things of that nature. The city of Detroit, well, let me just, so you'll know about me. When I came in the office of mayor, Mayor Young had been to the bond market and borrowed $130 million to balance the budget because we had a huge deficit. I came in with great plans for the city of Detroit and found that I was going to inherit an $88.5 million deficit. Within 6 months, we balanced that budget, and every budget while I was in office, we had a balanced budget, we had a modest surplus, and we had, at one point it was reported in the press that our pension fund was overfunded by $921 million. It's been documented that while I was in office, over 7.5 of the 8 years that I was a vice president of a bank who kept track of the investments that were being made, $20.2 billion of investment in the city of Detroit. The city of Detroit, by every major newspaper, was described as a comeback city. In 1990, the city of Detroit, that's 4 years before I came in the office, 1990, the city of Detroit was labeled or declared by the Census Department as being the city that had the highest percentage of people living below poverty, 32.2%. When you factored in the number of children who lived in those households, 46.6% of our children lived below poverty. We needed jobs. 35% of the age-eligible adults could not afford to own a car in the city of Detroit. The 2000 census, 6 years after I was in office, indicated that there were 15 other cities that had a higher percentage rate. We created thousands of new jobs. We turned the city around, balanced budget, hope, etc. It made a big difference. And I had a great working relationship with the city council with which I worked with. There's only 2 or 3 issues that I was not able to get past. One is because I declared that I was not going to run again. And when you're in a lame duck, you were just that, a lame duck. But I will tell you, the city was on its way. We got hit with a perfect storm. One was the mortgage debacle that was not the doing of the city of Detroit. That reduced property tax, that was the amount of money, because the city of Detroit needed property tax and income tax in order to receive revenue to pay its bill. The second thing that we got hit with was the loss of manufacturing jobs, when at the time when the gasoline went to $4 a gallon and you went to fill up your SUV and it cost you over $100 and people were starting to lose jobs because of layoffs that were occurring. Second bullet point. And then the third was because despite the fact we had some good times and economic times and good jobs in the city of Detroit when I was mayor, we lost still 7.5% of our population because it kept going down. When Mayor Kilpatrick was in office, and with all of the negative publicity and things that occurred, we lost 25% of our population within a 10-year growth. And so that meant when people are leaving because they want safer streets, because Mayor Kilpatrick laid off police officers, wouldn't replace police officers who retired. You didn't have safety, so people left. And so when you lose that kind of population, in addition to those of us who live and remain in the city, we still were receiving less money for the city to run itself on from income tax and from real estate. And then finally, when you get that big crunch of people leaving, you have a huge loss, which made it almost impossible to run a city.
Yeah. Mayor, thank you. That was an incredibly comprehensive overview of what happened in the city. And I think it's a great segue to Councilwoman Jenkins and your time as City Council President. One of the things that I think could be really useful for students and others to know about is what's it like in a crisis management situation? You're confronted with not only enormous financial challenges, but political challenges to your own legitimacy. You have the state looking to take over your operation saying, you're essentially not cutting it from local rule, but we're going to come in, we're going to appoint an emergency manager, we're going to bring in professionals. What was that time like in the city? And tell me, and tell the students a little bit, what's it like to be in a city that's essentially taken over by those from outside the city?
Difficult would probably be an understatement. Complex. It was, I was elected to Detroit City Council in 2010. So as Mayor Archer talks about the history of the city, I came into office, although I was there when he was mayor, I was working for the president of City Council at the time. So I got to see it from both sides. I got to see the budget process where you were talking about where to spend the money, you know, and what to do with the surplus versus when I came into office, the entire conversation is where we're going to cut, how we cut, what do we cut, what else do we cut? Well, when you have a police department that's already half the size that it should be, what do you cut? When you have bus services where people are literally, students are at the bus stop longer than they're in school, literally, where do you cut? So these are the kinds of questions that we were faced with coming into office. And you have people who are saying, well, wait a minute. I remember reading that we had a surplus in our pension funds. Where did that go? Did Kwame Kilpatrick steal all of this money? What happened to this money? You have people who are coming in who are saying things like, if you cut your staff, then we can solve this budget problem. As the legislative body, one of the differences is there's much more accessibility. We start all of our council meetings with public comment. So we got the brunt of the public, the anger. Like we've had people picket our houses. They had the wrong address for me, so they picketed the wrong house. It worked out. but literally, no wonder you got elected. But we literally had people coming out, threatening us, picketing our houses, and you had a council who, for all of my life, I have watched our city go from what's described as one of the greatest cities in the nation to the steady decline. I don't know the Detroit of the 1950s and the 1960s. I'm breaking with tradition, ladies. I was born in 1970. So I don't know that Detroit that everybody talks about in its heyday. For me, in high school, I thought Detroit was great because we had a huge department store downtown that we could go to. And so for all of my adult life, I just watched it do this. And you come into office and you say, well, when you're talking to the governor, while I believe strongly in democracy, I believe strongly in local control, the conflict is if you live in the city of Detroit and you're living in the dark and you call the police and they don't show up, if your mom or your dad is having a heart attack and you call EMS and you don't know if there's an ambulance coming, at what point do you say, what's the purpose of democracy if people aren't getting the services that they're being promised from their government? So that was our dilemma, was trying to figure out how to balance the importance of local control, how to balance what we had promised to do. We said we'll come in and we're going to be responsible elected leaders, but what does responsibility mean and how much control really? I mean, one of the first things we voted on when we came into office in 2010 was to borrow $250 million to try to address that $315 million deficit. And we had a restructuring plan that was supposed to take care of the rest. Well, in reality, one, just borrowing, continuing to increase our debt to solve our problems didn't work. We had already proven over and over and over again that that didn't work. But the other piece of it was just structurally, the city was not in a place where we could turn things around and make this work without some drastic change. And some of those changes were things that could not happen quickly enough under the normal rule of democracy. So as elected officials, as difficult a decision as it was, we said, you know, we have to bite the bullet, because ultimately what was most important is finding a way to bring our city back and to make it, and I agree 100% with Mayor Archer, Detroit is the place to be. I mean, getting there now, 10 years from now, people are gonna look back and say, wow, this place is amazing. At 5 years from now, people will say, who would have thunk it, right?
It's already happening
It's
today.
yes,
And
it's already
I think that's a great segue because of all of those challenges that really stressed local officials. The question is, how do you solve 50 years of structural problems? I think that's a perfect segue into Jim and his team and other consultants that came in from Ernst & Young and from Miller Buckfire, Conway McKenzie, and approached, and hopefully, Jim, you can give us a little bit of the history, approached the governor's office early on, seeing that there was both a challenge for the city and an opportunity for the private sector to come in and offer some help. Why don't you walk us through those early discussions?
Sure, that's a great introduction to the dilemma that we saw and the opportunity, as it would be, that we saw for leadership in Michigan to take a decidedly different tact with dealing with a decades of decline in Detroit and an issue that many aging municipalities face and continue to face in the United States. We looked at Detroit in the latter part of last decade and saw, as has already been referenced here, deep structural budget deficits and declining revenues that were created from decades of promises in regards to where pensions would be, in regards to retiree health care benefits, where people really, it wasn't silver plated, it wasn't gold plated, it was platinum plated. It was for them and their spouse and their surviving spouse, and it was better than Medicare, and they didn't even have to rely on Medicare. And we saw a situation where, to meet these promises, as well as to continue to try to light the streets, run the ambulances, run the fire departments, run the police department, the city was having to borrow. And it was having to borrow, and at the point the capital markets had said, no, there's no more money from us. And what had happened, and this is akin to what we see in corporate settings sometimes where you have a stress situation, is parent didn't really want to deal with the issue yet, parent being Michigan. So parent gave subsidiary a new revenue source, 3 casinos. Revenue from that. Well, that worked a little bit, and then as it came about, that revenue source, as much as it was generating, that ended up getting pledged and hawked to the capital markets as the news got tighter. City still needed money. State didn't want to deal with the issue again. Passed new law, said, well, I know we give you this distributable state aid. We know it's the most steady part of your budget, as it would be your income stream. We'll allow you to hawk that to get the next round of financing done. So that gets pledged once, gets actually pledged again, and more debt gets raised, not for and nor where it should be in municipal finance, to build infrastructure, to create revenue, to create opportunity that can pay off that debt, but to build bridges to recovery that really more resemble piers or ramps into very bad places. And city was still not current. And so we see that situation developing. We see the credit ratings declining. See bad swap liabilities, and see overall a situation where Detroit and Michigan and the surrounding counties were through decades of where there was a deeply uncollaborative and combative environment. Counties, Oakland County, AAA rated, versus Detroit. No collaboration there. And so what did we do? As Matt was indicating, well, kind of strange. We wrote a letter. We wrote a letter to Governor Snyder, Governor-elect Snyder, newly elected Republican, really a long shot at the beginning of the race, a guy from corporate America who had turned around Gateway Computer and had sold it, and who was elected to the governor's office in Michigan under the somewhat unusual election slogan, "One tough nerd" was his slogan, and it got him elected. And we wrote him a letter and said, listen, we're looking at this situation, and we see decades of bad policy, recent years of bad decisions, but it looks a lot to us like a situation that could be considered akin to a corporate restructuring. And the bad decisions that had been made were akin to the bad decisions that get made by good businesses that have changes in circumstance and bad capital structures and really are forced to make decisions to feed the capital structure rather than create value. And we said, we're not saying we have the answer for you, but what we would like to do is begin to think about this problem with you, about how we could look at Detroit and think about a reboot, a fundamental rethink of where the business plan is, where the strategy of Detroit is, and look at that free from the liabilities as we do in the corporate restructuring setting, and determine from there what is the best path forward. What's the best path forward to service the creditors that have grown over time, but also just to protect the your citizens of Michigan. And when Governor Snyder was making the decisions to move forward with the consent decree and then to declare a financial emergency, to place Kevin Orr in place, and eventually, upon Kevin Orr's recommendation to file for bankruptcy, he was doing that first and foremost to fulfill his constitutional responsibility to protect the citizens of Michigan and the citizens of Detroit. And the plan, or the essential strategy was, well, we just have to take a stop. We have to determine where this city can best go. What has to be done to make this a place where people want to live and want to work and can do so safely. And in that environment, we came up with a very detailed plan, as was suggested here, that the city needed a staggering $1.4 billion of reinvestment and revitalization spending over the next 10 years just to get it to a baseline of acceptable services. It was service insolvent, and that was a message that everybody universally agreed upon, that the court universally agreed upon as well. The implications of that, that money couldn't be borrowed. We had no capacity to pay it back. The implications was that was $1.4 billion that was going to come out of creditor recoveries and money that otherwise would have serviced creditors. The only thing that the creditors could pretty much universally agree upon in the city of Detroit was that their particular liability was the special one and was more important than any other creditor's liability, and that it should be serviced in full, and the remainder of the creditors would just have to deal with the consequences of their bad decisions to effectively lend the city money. So that's a little stretch there, but that set up a process for us that we thought could lead to what is the bringing Detroit back. I don't really like the back because I don't think it's going back to where it was, right? But giving Detroit and its citizens a future where they weren't just paying for $18 billion of liabilities, where they could have a capital structure that was manageable and they could make good policy decisions about restoring services and creating a new city that could be a beacon of economic activity, new types of economic activity, artistic, transportation, logistics, and a future where the population would stabilize and grow and economic opportunity would be there. So I'll stop with that and we'll see where it goes.
That was a great overview, and I'm sure in our discussion and questions from the audience, we'll get into more of the particulars of how that happened. I think an interesting note when you talk about Governor Snyder is not only was his slogan "One Tough Nerd," but he has another slogan of "Relentless Positive Action," which sounds sort of hackneyed, except for the fact that the guy really believes it. And it has been a mantra that has really driven his administration to tackle what some people consider untacklable problems. He's also a trained CPA, MBA, JD. So
he's quite a force.
Yeah, he's definitely a nerd. So Garrett, I think one of the things that you can bring is a little bit of a voice of this room, in that you watched Detroit from a different perspective. And one of the things that we've talked about is that Detroit is iconic to people for a variety of different reasons. So it's iconic in its manufacturing, it's iconic in its music, it's also iconic in its politics. For those sort of on the liberal side of the ledger, they would see the strength of unionism to bring a new middle class, not only to the city, but to the nation. Maybe on the conservative side of the ledger, there would be people that would say, this is a failed Great Society mistake. But I think, at the point now that we're in our discussion of reaching this point to go into bankruptcy, what was it like to think about the problems that were being talked about in Detroit on a national basis? Were people thinking, are we the next Detroit, or Detroit's its own problems, we don't want to get too close? What was the national perspective?
Well, first of all, a couple of things. Having talked about the governor, one tough nerd, I'm delighted to be in a room full of nerds or potential nerds, apparently. You're all going for your MBAs. And I'd say two additional things at the outset. The first is, remember that the four people to my right are people who know the Detroit story in depth and lived it, reported it, restructured it, governed it. So whatever you hear from me about Detroit, you should put in that perspective. That the real knowledge base about Detroit lies to my right. The way that when this discussion first surfaced, and I should say that your professor and I have known each other since we were your age, and if that's a kind of a frightening thought about what lies ahead of you, too bad, because it does if you're lucky. As I participated in these discussions, read the early work, the work that Shelby and Kyle were doing, which I think, by the way, is really excellent, a really excellent case study, and the output from that class, believe me, is first rate. I realized how little I knew about the specifics of Detroit itself, but as our moderator and reporter, Matt, has suggested, I began to think about it and see it in a perspective that was not site-specific, but more in terms of, so if we do a deep dive on this, as the case study is done and as these people are doing, when we're through with the deep dive, when we've learned this enormous depth about the specifics of Detroit, aside from Detroit, What have we learned? And it struck me that there are several themes, several business-related, though this is as Jim Doak has said, this is about a municipality. This is about the public service. But there are business-related themes here. It seems to me that the mixture of those two, I came away at the outset thinking about 4 or 5 things. One is, if you study this case study, in addition to understanding Detroit, you must come away understanding something about race and diversity demographically. If you don't get, if you have not understood the extent to which that was at play in Detroit, both negatively and positively, you will not have understood the Detroit story. And therefore, when you look around for the next one that might be around the corner, and surely there is one, you know, you won't be able to deal with it competently if you haven't understood that first piece. The second thing that I think, it's also a diversity theme. This is a story about what happens in a one-crop economy. And if you studied the South in the 18th and 19th century, and you know about that little conflagration we had in the middle of the 19th century, you understand how powerful the failure of a one-crop economy can be to lives and to a polity. And as a consequence, you understand that business and economics isn't some, you know, sort of remote, distant thing. It's about people getting up every day and having a job and going to that job and being able to do the things that they're able to do because they have a job. And that when that changes, everything changes. And so that seemed to me to be the second. The third thing that I was struck by is a combination, it's sort of a meeting of 2 fancy terms that get tossed around a lot, an old one and a relatively new one. If you read The Economist, Joseph Schumpeter, you know about the concept of creative destruction. And clearly, Detroit, particularly the automobile industry, is a case of, there's a message in there about creative destruction. Which is central to capitalism, which is really the guts of this Professor Furster's course. In addition to that, the newer concept that Professor Clayton Christensen at the Harvard Business School is best known for, you understand the concept of disruptive innovation. And how, on the one hand, disruptive innovation may be the future of Detroit. That things will happen in Detroit that will bring it back, that are reflections of what that concept means. So without belaboring this point, just hold those 2 thoughts, creative destruction and disruptive innovation, in mind. Think about those concepts and think about them when you're looking at other seemingly intractable sets of issues, and say to yourself, so am I seeing creative destruction at worst? Am I seeing disruptive innovation at work? And I think the answer clearly in Detroit is that you were. You cannot look at this story without understanding the connection of the themes of greed and power. And I would add to that the power of corporate cultures. The corporate culture, for example, at General Motors and elsewhere simply either could not see or refused to believe what was in front of them in their own business. And so they went to lunch, and when they came back, there were suddenly Japanese cars in the parking lot. And again, because of the power and the greed factor and the intense lobbying that the automobile industry did in Washington, D.C. in particular, to make certain that they didn't have to sort of try to be at least on the front edge of the wave or the curve. Detroit paid dearly for this, and so did the country. And I think the final thing that I would say is the sort of the fifth piece of this for me is the concept of unintended consequences. You've heard from, beginning with Mayor Archer and from our friend Santil, who saw it from the legislative side both as a staff member and an elected member of council, and of course from Jim, who got to do the immense work, and Matt, who reported on it. You've heard what people did and what happened, and what's often the most important learning that can come from any situation like this is to be able to ferret out, well, what were the unintended consequences. I mean, some good decisions were made that seemed good at the time that ended up having unintended consequences. Happens all the time. I think it was the mayor who talked about perfect storm. You know, if you got a perfect storm, you got a perfect storm, and there's nothing you can do about it. So I don't know if that covers the territory you wanted, but I just think that the ability to sort of think thematically and to think strategically about what do the specifics of this case teach me that I can take with me to wherever I'm going next. Not because it's going to have the same ones, but to have that same capacity to look inside and think strategically. That seems to me to be.
I think those are some great insights, not only, as you say, to Detroit, but in a lot of places. And I think it's a great way of then shifting the conversation a little bit to get a little bit more specific about Detroit. And one of the things I think would be interesting to a lot of folks would be, what were the warning signs in Detroit? How were they treated? And with the sort of 20/20 hindsight, could other decisions have been made to prevent the outcome that happened here? Because I think with a number of other distressed municipalities and states, the question is, what can we do to prevent what happened in Detroit, even though the restructuring in Detroit is seen by many as at least an early success? So, Jim, do you want to start with that idea? I mean, you spent a lot of time thinking about the solutions, but what were some of the missed calls?
Well, you know, it's an interesting question, because I think by the time I am there, it's really the die has been cast, right? Both because decision makers have an awfully tough time in corporate and municipal and sovereign settings in admitting that there's really no other alternative. And also, and we may get into this, because I think the capital markets fail some corporates and certainly municipals in that they are willing to provide, as I've already indicated, you know, funding well past the point where where the funding should be taken. But people decide to take the next hit, the next drink. And
what's the solution to that? Because I think that's a really interesting question for those that might be going into that world. Mm-hmm. There were a number of folks that lent money to Detroit, knowing full well what the economic condition was in the city.
Right.
And went ahead with deals that had disastrous effects. I mean, the swaps deal in particular, maybe you can tell folks a little bit about what happened there, because it was an enormous bet for the city. The city at the time, I believe, was arguing, and maybe Santil, you can help us with that a little bit, that absent that deal, the city probably would have filed for some sort of bankruptcy at that time, that it was that critical. But why don't you walk us through a little bit of that
Sure,
swap deal?
sure. So it's really I think one of the it's about adequate oversight on those early moments to make the right decision. And the transaction, very controversial transaction that that Mr. Dolan is referring to, is a decision that was made in the Kilpatrick administration with the assistance of major investment banks to engage in a very creative transaction to skirt state borrowing limits, to borrow money, borrow $1.4 billion over 2 years to fund the pension trusts, the two single employer pension trusts in Detroit, and to borrow that money and borrow it theoretically at a rate that was below the theoretical rate that the pension trust should be earning money, and then through that wonderful alchemy of Excel, create value. And the transaction, the financing that was undertaken, we're now going to go into nerddom. Basically, put a floating rate paper into the municipal market, raised the money. It was not a general obligation security of the city. It was something less than, something different than. Somehow the banks found some great German banks over in Europe that made the decision to buy this paper, as well as buy a lot of other crap from the United States over that period of time. By floating rate. At the same time, they threw on top of it a derivative swap that gave the city an overall flat income, or flat sort of cost of capital, and voila, it was a wonderful transaction. Several years later, once the credit rating of the city started to fall, all of these swaps that were supposed to be protecting the city and keeping the cost of this particular debt level started to go into default. And this is the same thing, by the way, if you read the headlines these days. It's a big issue in Chicago, Cook County, Chicago Public Schools. As their credit ratings fall, all of their derivatives are going sideways. Once the credit ratings go down, it gives the swap counterparty the ability to exit the swap, where interest rates had been, as much as this was just supposed to be a contract that kind of offset the cash flow stream, all of a sudden this became an immediate $300 million due balance to these investment banks.
Jim, when was the $1.4 billion deal done?
The $1.4 billion deal was done in 05, 06.
In 05 and 06, we had a tidal wave of fixed income liquidity globally. Way too much money, chasing way too few good opportunities. Perfect storm.
It was the clear blue day right before the perfect storm that put all the boats out on the water with inadequate water and life jackets, right, as it would be. So this is one of the crises that that Santil's era of council had to deal with, which was this extraordinarily controversial decision at the time that had been proceeded upon, was creating a real-time crisis, and over time that particular liability was the one that ended up getting a secured interest in the casino tax and the gaming revenues. So now a relatively stable revenue stream is about to be sucked away from the city, and that particular transaction, more so than any other, precipitated the Chapter 9 of the city of Detroit, because it created the extraordinary near-term funding challenge, because the swaps were also insured by insolvent insurers who were ready to seize that money. That was creating the liquidity crisis that could have prevented the city from funding payroll. And the transaction was one big sort of papering over of a gaping hole. If that transaction didn't occur,
I think there's a strong probability that the city could have and should have thought about an aggressive restructuring during the Granholm gubernatorial administration. I don't know whether that administration, given its relation to, to the city and the way it leaned, would have, pushed in that particular direction.
And a side note to that, I think, if I'm having the deal correct, is that at the time it was Bond Buyer's Deal of the Year or something. I mean, the city got an award for its innovative approach to financing, right?
The city and the investment bankers got an award.
Right.
So we were wondering whether we could get an award from the bond buyer for the restructuring. We haven't applied yet.
But Mayor, I wanted to turn to you because, of course, hindsight is 20/20. But these aren't only financial deals that are made, but also political decisions. And there's been a fair amount of criticism of the city and its leaders over the years that they were essentially too beholden to organized labor and offered packages to city workers that were unsustainable. I know you talked about the fact that during your own administration, there were surpluses and balanced budgets. But what about the idea that, that there was a perpetuation for many mayoral administrations of simply a system that was not going to be sustainable in the long term? Tell me a little bit about your thinking on the relationship with organized labor.
Well, I've got perhaps a different point of view. Here's what I mean. I believe in transparency. I'm a lawyer by profession. I believe in ethics, integrity, and I believe in being forthright with the people that you are going to work with and or serve. And so I always had open books that I would invite labor to come in and take a look at, and here's what we can afford to do, and here's what we can't afford to do. When I became mayor, the police department had not had a contract for 3 years, and now we're entering into the second 3 years, because typically they're 3 years. And whatever settlement is arranged with the police, it also, the fire department gets the same kind of contract. We looked at what it was costing for example, health insurance. With their health insurance, they had a company that if there was a claim for disability, rare was it that it was rejected by the insurance company. And we looked at the cost of insurance, and we went and said, look, and we put on the table the absolute best Blue Cross Blue Shield insurance that you could buy, that anyone could buy, absolute premium, the best, and it was rejected. The city of Detroit was paying, for example, a 13th check. If there was a surplus in the pension fund, the city of Detroit would distribute that money to all of the retirees and those who are working for the city of Detroit. The first opportunity we had to, because it came up, to take a look at the city charter and what should be revised, I put on the table, we do not want to pay the 13th check because that money should stay there because you never know what the economy is going to do. And so we got it passed, they defeated us in the trial court, they came back, tried to put it up again, and we lost it. And so the unions are very strong, but also please appreciate the following. When you work for a city or a county or state government, or the federal government for that matter, in the world in which you're going to be sharing your talents and using your skills, people make things. And when they make things, whether it's selling a bottle of wine or selling a cup of coffee, whatever it is they're manufacturing, people are going to be able to make a profit. When they make a profit, there's going to be an opportunity for stock, an opportunity for raises and good years, etc. You can't do that in the city. And so what city leaders were being faced with was how do you address not being able to give bonuses or whatever the case may be when things are going on. So they started coming up with a good pension plan and the 13th check. And those are the kind of things that come back to haunt you. And so I tried my best when I was there to make a difference and was not successful in terms of getting rid of the 13th check. And I think Jim would agree that the 13th check was one of the reasons why the pension fund, there were others, but one of the reasons why the pension fund had some issues. The other thing that you did not mention that I think needs to be said, on the swap issue that was done, that they got this great award for, there was a triggering mechanism that if for any reason any of the rating agencies dropped the city of Detroit's bond rating, it immediately called for the profit that would have been made to be paid immediately. Am I right?
No, that's right.
And what they tried to do, because they had no money to do it, that's when they pledged the gaming proceeds. If we had not had casino gaming revenues coming into the city, we would have been in bankruptcy long before we entered into bankruptcy, which was the right thing to do at the time. The unions, please appreciate the following. If General Motors and Chrysler would have gone into bankruptcy, they would have taken down Ford Motor Company, who did not apply because, please appreciate, if they went into bankruptcy, those companies would have been gone. This United States of America would have gone into a depression. We wouldn't have a recession, we'd have had depression. The unions were the ones who negotiated and worked and took concessions in working with businesses to give the businesses a chance to come back. So while we can, and it's legitimate to say they're always asking for example, in Wayne County, Michigan, today, with which Detroit is in Wayne County, Warren Evans, who is the newly elected as of this past November, Wayne County executive. He has inherited a nightmare of, which may bring you all back, a nightmare in terms of what is owed by way of a deficit. He has said, in order to address this issue, we're going to have to take some cuts. And this is what I propose that the employees do, this is what I propose, whatever the case may be. First, out of the box, the union president saying, we're not taking any cuts. What do you mean take cuts? That's not fair for us to have to take cuts. You all did it. We didn't do it. Why are you going to make us pay for it? Why do we? So you get into that, and then people take a look at the unions and have an immediate reaction one way or the other. But if you take a look at the unions across the board, they have allowed our country to grow. We've had some real challenges. And they have engaged in concession bargaining. Do they make sometimes outrageous demands? Absolutely. But will they negotiate? They will if you're transparent and you open up the book and stop hide and go seek. And if you're honest with them. That's what has to be, I think, moving forward and going forward, taken into consideration.
Yeah, and I think, Mayor, that there's also been an interesting moment for Detroit with the takeover of the emergency manager, the filing of bankruptcy, and now even post-bankruptcy. The relationship between the city and labor is changed, and the power that labor did have is not the same.
Listen,
that may change going forward, but
unions fought the emergency manager law. They got a statewide ballot, got signatures, and it was recalled. And in the November election, right after it was recalled, Governor Snyder and the legislature redid the emergency financial law, put an appropriation on it, tied it to that law, and therefore the law could not be recalled, and it gave the emergency manager even more power to do what frankly needed to be done.
yeah, and that's a great entry, I think, into what life.
Oh wait, one more final point.
Sure.
Unions fought at every step Kevin Orr's recommendations as it relates to how to solve the city's problems. At the end of the day, every one of them unions was on board because they understood, and he stayed firm, but he was transparent, he was respectful. Every one of those unions came on board and said yes. They agreed with the plan.
And I wanted to see if we could get others on that part of the conversation too, because it was certainly not an easy ride. I think that for folks already here, I'm sure they know, there were more than 100,000 creditors in this case. And it meant that pension holders and city employees, people that were looking for retiree health care, were standing next to banks and bond insurers. And one of the things I think would be interesting for us to hear more about, Jim and Santiago, is what the relationship was like when your firm and others came in to essentially help guide the city through this process. I imagine that a lot of the students and others must be wondering, that seems like a big culture clash. So can you tell me what it was like when you started hiring these restructuring professionals, and then all of a sudden Kevin Orr shows up to the chagrin of some council members, but what was that time like?
It was an interesting time. It was, and there was a clash of cultures. There was it was like bringing groups of people who all spoke different languages. You know, there's a group over here who speaks Chinese, and then there's a group over here who speaks Spanish, and there's a group over here who speaks English, but none of them understand the other's language. So you have labor, and as Jim has said, they thought they were the most important people in the room. And then you have the creditors, and they're the most important people in the room. And you have the citizens, and they're the most important people in the room. And our job was to try to navigate all of those waters and try to find the best solutions. Which, in some cases, the mayor talked a little bit about when he was in office and the surplus. And in some cases, the changes that should have been made at that time were probably more difficult to make than when you're broke. It's easier to make the case. It's a lot harder to say we have a surplus, but we're not going to give raises because our population is still declining. So we need to try to prepare for the future. As elected officials, you're thinking, most elected officials think in election cycles. You know, if we're being completely honest, they're not thinking 10, 20 years down the line. They're thinking right now. So what is the fastest way to try to solve this problem today? And sometimes it makes sense. Awards for the swap deals. At the time, they said, this was great. You know, that everybody pat themselves on the back and they said we did a good job, without an understanding of the future consequences. You do the best you can at the time, and we can't always predict the future. So, I mean, to be quite honest, even the decisions that were made while I was on council, I think we made some good decisions, but we won't really know for 5, 10, 20 years how good those decisions were. And it's easy to continue to kick a can down the road when you don't believe the road will ever end. And nobody thought the road in Detroit would ever end. Nobody ever thought Detroit would go into bankruptcy. Nobody ever thought GM, the largest corporation in the world, would end up in the situation it was in. So then it was a little easier to continue to make those decisions because you believed at some point somebody was going to come in and save us, or at some point there would be a perfect storm that would help to turn it around.
Yeah. And Jim, what was it like from your perspective as you started to work with people in the city of Detroit?
It was fascinating, right? Because I'm 80% of my prior time is spent working with economic animals, right? Distressed hedge funds, corporate managers, boards of directors, P&L minded, IRR focused. You know, how can we turn this around? What's the EBITDA multiple, right? The 20 other percent, I think, and it was fortunate, was spent over the prior time was spent with the Teamsters. So that was the beginning of the training that, okay, wait a minute, sometimes in restructurings you have entities that don't think in necessarily in rational IRR calculations. They're political entities. They may even know what the right answer is. The leadership may know what the right answer is, but they can't necessarily draw the straight line to get there. You have to help them draw the wide line to get to the end point. You kind of have to help them back into the situation, maintain their control over their group. You could say selfishly allow them to get reelected, but also in many of these organizations, they have to get out the vote and they have to explain the situation to a set of folks who just drive a truck and just want to drive a truck. So you can spend all your time you want explaining to, like, you know, Hoffa's PhDs as to why this is the answer. And they can say, yeah, but you got to understand, I got to get this out for a vote. And that was the pulling it in here. That was some of the same concerns that we had. Even if you think about, you know, eventually the decision to bring this into a Chapter 9 context, you know, was the great forcing function. It was the best tool that we had. I'm not saying it's the optimal tool. I'm not saying, you know, I'm saying there wasn't a better tool, right? But even that structure itself had a process where the retirees had to vote on the plan, where the union members, where the 40 unions had to vote on new collective bargaining agreements, including the horse farriers union, which had one member in the city of Detroit. Just the stuff you'd encounter. But so the challenge, so some of the challenge recognizing that was, you know, we were stepping into dialogues that had stretched a decade, right, and had all sorts of background and were coming at things from a very particular angle of how they saw the past, how they saw the future, and what they thought was important. And at some point, we're going to discuss, I think, at this panel, you know, each one of those polities had a distinct view as to exactly how much money and how important was the Detroit Institute of Arts, right? So you're sitting here in this very unique circumstance where for those that aren't familiar, the city actually, and this hasn't occurred elsewhere, the city actually owned the Detroit Institute of Arts. And there was, if you had to look at the collection of paintings, there was a portion of the collection, a considerably valuable portion of the collection, that was acquired by the museum and the city in the heyday of Detroit. Basically in the 1920s and in the 1950s, the city sent people over to Europe with checkbooks and say, buy some good stuff, bring it back, because we're creating, you know, the Motor City. And that was the stuff that was the scariest for us, because it really did look like an asset of a debtor. And in our world, that stuff can get monetized. And then from there, you went to other very valuable pieces of work that had been donated by the Ford family, and the future, and whether it could be kept clear or whether it would be litigated wasn't clear. But, you know, for a creditor, for an insolvent insurer, where it's life or death, like life or your art, you know, it's like, let's sell the art. When it's and I can't do it justice, but when it's a decision for a Detroit retiree, an 80-year-old widow who doesn't have another supplemental source of income and relies on her husband's Detroit pension, and that's going to get cut, and she's not going to be able to afford to stay in her home, pay her heat bill, and eat. Like, who cares? Who cares about the Rembrandt and the Diego Rivera on the wall?
I think, Jim, you raise a great point, because it really sort of underscores the power of a judge and the city in Chapter 9 proceedings, right, which is very different from the role of creditors in corporate bankruptcy cases. And so both the judge and the city had a lot of leeway to say there are some assets of the city that we are going to decide what the future of that asset is going to be, not creditors that would have to be liquidated to serve their needs. But I want to bring Garrett back into the discussion to talk about, again, a broader idea that was happening in those years in the US, and that's bailout, right? It became sort of the word that no one wanted to say in Detroit. There were some elected leaders and other leaders in Detroit who had said Detroit needs a bailout. The White House said no bailout. The governor even said repeatedly, over and over again, no bailout, and I think that there's some dispute now about whether or not what was provided, $200 million directly from the state, as part of a grand bargain package would constitute a bailout. But I wanted to ask you about this idea of there was a bailout for GM and Chrysler during the recession. There was a bailout of the banks. What was going on, do you think, at that time in the US? Did we have bailout fatigue? Why weren't people saying, well, let's rescue Detroit? It seems to be in great need.
Well, the short answer to that question is that if there's a full awareness today of the nature of our politics and the extent to which they have become not simply partisan, but really provocatively so. It makes the concept of a bailout sort of dead meat politically, because one person's bailout is another person's. This is the role of government. One could argue that we bail out hedge fund executives every single day with a tax rate that most Americans would kill to have. I'm confident that hedge funds executives don't think of their special tax break as a bailout, but it's a bailout. There are thousands of farmers around the country who don't grow crops who get bailed out. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is two things. One, because our politics are so polarized, the concept of middle ground, the concept of the kinds of things that Jim had to do, you can still do at the local level. It's still possible, though it's defying gravity, but you can do it. But don't try doing it with the United States Congress.
What about the overlay of race? I mean, you brought up the issue of race. There are a number of people in the city and around the country that would argue that in a city, a majority African-American city with a large population of those in poverty, that simply people, that elected leaders nationally did not want to bail out Detroit because it was seen as a problem of its own making, and there was even discrimination against the city because of what it was. And had it been someplace else, that the result would have been different. I mean, is that what you're thinking in terms of race, or where is race playing a role in the future?
Well, I think it seems to me, and I think the all four people to my right can speak to this more specifically, but it seems to me that race is a major theme and a minor theme all the way through the Detroit story. But if we come back to, as the mayor was talking about 1976 in New York and a bailout, race was not the issue in New York that race was and is in Detroit today. I think that I wanted to say two things related to this, if I could quickly. One was when Santel was talking about, you're making decisions and you don't know, you just don't know. That's the unintended consequences thing that I was talking about before. There's an apocryphal story about Henry Kissinger's trip to China when we opened up relations with China, when we began opening relations with China. He preceded Nixon's visit. And in one of his meetings, he meets with the famous premier, Chu En-lai, who was number 2 to Mao Zedong. And in the course of their conversation about all things, world history, Kissinger says to him, "So what do you think about the French Revolution?" And Chu En-lai says, without pausing, "It's too soon to tell." So one of the messages, it seems to me, and that I heard in this last round of discussions, beginning with the mayor and Santel and Jim, is as follows. Classic examples of it's too soon to tell and unintended consequences. You're surrounded by them in public policy. The second thing, which I've often said, that if somebody said to me, look, I got 30 seconds, could you explain politics and public policy to me? I would say, yeah, I'll tell you 2 things. And here's the one that I think came out of this discussion today. And it's what I call dueling truths. The Nobel Prize-winning awarded physicist Niels Bohr, back in the 1930s, once observed that there were 2 kinds of truths. He said there are small truths, the opposite of which is a falsehood. And there are great truths, the opposite of which is another great truth. And in public policy, you are often dealing with these 2 great truths. I mean, just think about that little anecdote that Jim was talking about on the one hand, you got your Rembrandt, and on the other hand, you've got your widow, who's, so who's right? Well, there isn't a right. There isn't, I mean, this ain't math. This is the realm that people like the mayor and Santel who get elected and deal with every single day, which is the concept of dueling truths. And that's why the phrase "to govern is to make choices" really sort of captures it all.
Let me ask one more sort of general question for everyone, for anyone who wants to jump in, and then
before you ask that general
Sure.
question, let me just make this observation. One of the things that I think is important for all of you to understand, based on the question that was asked here in terms of what occurred as it relates to Detroit and issue of race and things of that nature, I want you to recall that when President George W. Bush was in office, and we were faced with financial institutions having serious problems because they had, among other things, there's a requirement under FDIC that if you have any kind of distress money that's out there that you've got investment in, you've got to have that cash money on hand to be able to respond. That came out of the savings and loans issue back with Keating and others back in the day. And when the financial institutions and Lehman Brothers were gone, etc., I want you to remember, or if you don't remember, go back and read that Paulson and Bernanke came in with, in effect, 2 or 3 pieces of paper and asked for billions of dollars to be able to help financial institutions that were too big to fail. And by the way, you will not find when that was being asked, not one CEO of the financial institution coming before members of Congress and asking for assistance or explaining what occurred. Bernanke and Paulson did it on their own, and I don't disagree with what occurred. But I want you to remember what occurred when General Motors and Chrysler and a board that I was serving on at the time, Johnson Controls, came down to support the reality that was needed by General Motors and Chrysler. The executives all showed up. And by the way, how were they treated? Interestingly enough, no one ever talked about the airplanes that the financial institutions CEOs and their executives use because they travel across the country. But when the automobile execs came down from Ford General Motors, someone interestingly enough suggested to the press they ought to go out there and take a look at the airport, at the Reagan Airport, and they saw all of these private jets. So the questions that they're asking, well, how did you get here today? Well, you're coming in and asking for money, but you came in on a private jet, didn't you? And so it began. And you know why it was asked? Because there was an infuriation that occurred between certain members of the Republican Party who lost friends because of a contract negotiation between the automotives and the UAW that gave the UAW employees the day off on the day of election, which meant on the days of election, they could go out and be engaged in helping candidates that they support to be reelected or to get elected. And they just made them out bare. Fortunately, President George W. Bush was not moved by all of that and was moving to be able to start the process of helping the automotives. And when President Barack Obama came in, he took care of it and made sure that it was done. You could not ask anybody in the halls of Congress on the Republican side whether there was any interest in being helpful to the city of Detroit. It was non-existent. Most were saying, let them go by the wayside. But that was not Governor Snyder's sense. Governor Snyder was strong as a battery acid. There's a difference between the mindset of who's there. And a lot had to do, regrettably, with the real issue of race. Race is alive and well in the United States of America. There's been a lot of great things that have changed since the walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and the other kinds of things that have occurred. But it's still embedded. And it becomes important in terms of what you do in whatever job you take in your future to be fair and take a look at what's in the best interest of America. Because when Americans go to the polls and vote, what they want at the end of the day is their candidate to win, to be sure. But what they want their candidates to, once elected, is to work with people to make America greater. When you start thinking back, even back with President Reagan and others, Tip O'Neill, I mean, they would work together. They'd fight like dogs on the House floor, but they would, after the session was over, they'd go have a drink somewhere and talk about what needed to be done in the best interest of America. Keep that in mind when you do your work. What's in the best interest of America?
Mayor, thank you. I think that was great because it helps us all to understand better sort of the political dynamics, which sometimes get overlooked if we look at it too clinically. I wanted to ask everyone on the panel a little bit about the future of the city. I think everyone here has studied its balance sheet. It's radically different. And it's sort of an amazing confluence of events came together in order for the Chapter 9 to be both successful and rapid. But I wondered about both opportunity and risks going ahead. Judge Rose said in his approval of the city's bankruptcy plan that there were a lot of things that could put the city at risk in the future. Questions about political leadership, questions about whether or not organized labor might be expecting to go back to the old times. But also there are many systemic problems in the city that have nothing to do with Chapter 9. Still, there's high unemployment, there's high crime, the vacancy problem in housing is enormous. So why don't you tell me a little bit about how each of you see both opportunities in the city going forward, and where is there risk still, even after sort of an extraordinary process? Jim, do you want to start that off a little bit?
Sure.
First?
And we've all discussed some of our preliminary thoughts on it, and as I mentioned, the opportunity, the critical element of, I think, the opportunity for Detroit is to make sure that when it's charting its future, it is not an attempt to go back to its past, right? The Chapter 9 and the restructuring process that we went through has opened the door to opportunity, but not necessarily to success. And it certainly doesn't avoid the hard choices that are going to have to occur in the coming years and the coming decades, because the city still does have a pension liability that has to be funded. It still does have a water system that has been underinvested in, and it still has major socioeconomic challenges that have to be addressed. One of the biggest risk or challenge areas going forward is the state of the public school system, which, as it turns out, and every state and every sort of system is different. The structural insolvency of the public school system had almost nothing to do. It was totally separate from the city. And as Santil indicated, it's an entity that has been under state emergency management for years, and still is a problem that has to be corrected and has to be solved, because if Detroit is going to be a city that can grow again, people are going to have to want to work there and live there and then make the decision to raise their families there. And you can't raise your family in a place where your kids can't get the education that you desire for them to get. So that is an enormous challenge. But the future for Detroit really, as I see it, comes from its superior geographic positioning right next to Canada. It's a superior logistical, light manufacturing, sort of new manufacturing situated municipality, and it's going to have to find ways to invest in public schools and invest in the vocational skills of its citizens to create that new future. The irony of the last thought on this, they'll say, is the irony, but also the wonderful fact of Detroit is its Latin motto, which was created in 1805 after the city burned down, was the two mottos were Cinerbus Resurgit and Speriamus Meliora. And I think I pronounced those close enough. But it was, but one is it rises from the ashes, and the other one is we hope for better things. And if the Chapter 9 did something, I think what it did is it created that light forward and that hope forward for the city to break free from what was really preventing it from ever creating value and safety in a place for its citizens to grow and create. And now they have the opportunity, the city has an opportunity to chart its own future again.
Santil, do you want to address that same issue? Where are there opportunities and where do you see risks for the city?
I think the opportunities do come in that with this bankruptcy, it's still fresh. People are open right now to change because people are vested in making sure we don't make the same mistakes of the past, making sure that at the end of the day, Detroit ends up in a better place than we are now. So we have to make sure that we take advantage of the opportunities that have been presented to us right now. I think those opportunities come for people internally and externally as it relates to things like you could come to Detroit and find a piece of land to do just about anything you want to do, and you can get it fairly cheaply. So that creates some opportunities for people that you won't get in a place like New York or some other city, even Chicago that's struggling right now. You can't go to Chicago and find land in the same way. So there are those opportunities. I think there are opportunities because there are generational shifts, and I agree, race, if you look at it, it plays a part in Detroit's history on every level. Even today, the region, the Metro Detroit region, is one of the most segregated in the country. And it is, and although there are lots of different ethnicities, it's very segregated. If you look at any class picture in Detroit, for the most part, you're going to see people of color, or you're going to see Caucasians, and you'll see one or two sprinkled in between. I mean, and that's almost statewide. Generationally, that's changing. And if you come to Detroit now, it's a much more diverse place than it was. And diversity is not just race, it's economics, it's education. All of the things that bring diversity make for a healthier city and society. And we're headed in that direction because we have a generation that's not so bogged down in our past. So I think that creates some opportunities.
What are your concerns? What are your fears about maybe work that was not finished, or change that was not radical enough, or just even the systemic problems of poverty and education? Tell us a little bit about where, when you think about this late at night, about the future of the city, what are you thinking about?
My two biggest concerns, one is certainly the school system, and it's been under state control for more than a decade, and it's in much worse shape today than it was when the state took over. And you heard very little talk about our school systems in the city of Detroit during this whole bankruptcy process. And if we're ever gonna stabilize our population, even though people are moving there now, and it's hip and it's happening and you can't find a place to live downtown, when people start to settle down and have kids, then they make decisions like, where are my children going to school? So unless we fix that, we won't be able to stabilize our population long term. That's the first thing. For the city of Detroit, structurally, we missed, I believe, an opportunity to make some changes that would improve city services, such as our civil service rules. And we've talked about some of the union issues. And I think it's important for people to understand part of why we have such generous we've offered such generous benefits in the past is also because you had the city competing with GM and Ford and Chrysler to try to get the best and the brightest. We couldn't pay them. So yeah, we did offer more generous pension. We did offer more generous health care benefits, but as the times changed, we didn't. And even in the bankruptcy, we did not take the opportunity to make really important changes. Like I used this example last night, our fire department, with thousands of employees in the entire department, there are 4 non-union employees in our entire fire department. And the promotion system is strictly seniority. So you could have a Wharton MBA and you could have a person with a GED, and we need a finance manager in our fire department. The GED person has 6 months more seniority, they get the job. There's no way to improve the way we're doing business, not radically improve the way we're doing business, unless you make changes in those kinds of rules that continue to hold us back. So it's a missed opportunity.
Garrett, where do you see opportunity and risk in Detroit?
Well, I guess I would say 3 things. One, you know, Jim talked about this. You know, geography matters, and they've got it on their side. The second thing is, what sort of reminds me of that wonderful story about, I lived in Colorado for quite some time, and a fellow named John Elway who played for our football team, and in the NFL playoffs they were playing the Cleveland Browns, And it was first down on the Broncos' 2-yard line with something like a minute and a half left to go. John Elway steps into the huddle and he says, "We got them right where we want them." And it seems to me that in that sense, Detroit's got them right where they want them. I mean, as Santil said, that, you know, there are opportunities there literally for land, for being able to purchase things that are unpurchasable in other metropolitan areas. And at some point, that's got to matter. At some point, you know, a new wave of pioneers is going to come in, and there'll be this combination of new pioneers moving into a very significant piece of geography. But so those are my thoughts about Detroit.
Mayor, do you want to finish that up for us?
If you were to come to downtown Detroit today, you could not find a place to lease, buy, or rent. If you drove your car into a parking garage and asked, "Can I lease a space for my car?" you would be told, "I'm sorry, we do not have space." Same thing is occurring in Midtown. That's because so many people have come back into the city of Detroit. Dan Gilbert, Quicken Loans, committed to move into the city, was going to build an office building and found that it was going to cost him, and when the move was going to be made, right at the middle of the height of the recession, money was tight, the interest on the money was huge. So he decided not to build, but he leased office space, which was down. He was going to bring some 4,000 employees into the city of Detroit. Today he has 12,500. Dan Lepp, President, CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield, had to bring his employees together. He could have taken them any place, but he brought them to downtown Detroit. And so you've got downtown Detroit populated with young, dynamic people who are building their businesses and starting their businesses in high tech in our downtown office building. Dan Gilbert, who owns the majority of the Cleveland Cavaliers, has purchased about 60 downtown office buildings. Some were vacant, some were in distress, and they're being renovated, and new businesses are moving in, and young people are moving in. You go downtown on a Tuesday night, and you suddenly see anywhere between 1,500 and 2,000 young people doing what? Riding their bikes throughout the city of Detroit, and then they find a place to go after they get through riding, and they go and have a hamburger or have a beer or whatever the case may be. The business community, Dan Gilbert, Peter Carmanos, Mike Illich, and now his son Chris, Roger Penske, and Dan Lepp, have really invested in the city of Detroit, along with Rip Rapson, who is the CEO of the Kresge Foundation. This group, save for Dan Lepp, invested $130 million of their money to put a what's called an M1 rail line. It's going to be a streetcar line that will go from Woodward and Jefferson down Woodward Avenue to Midtown, West Grand Boulevard, and turn right around and come back. Dan Lepp and others have come up with $35 million to provide bridge loans for those who want to build new housing, whether it's got to be at least a minimum of 6 units, or if you want a maximum of 75 units. There is a lot of growth and development that is going on. The healthcare system, Henry Ford Hospital, they've invested millions in and around their hospital, as the case was Detroit Medical Center, and then you've got St. John's. You've got the Detroit Regional Chamber, which is the largest metropolitan chamber in the United States. They're all over trying to boost up and build up and support and promote the city of Detroit, as has the business group that used to be like this, one housed in Grand Rapids on the west side of the state, the other Detroit Renaissance. They've come together and they're supporting what goes on in the state. These are CEOs, and they are very much engaged, and they're very much supportive of the city of Detroit. Chris Illich is heading up the new arena for the Illich organization, or the Olympia organization. They're going to build a new hockey arena, And when it's all said and done, it's going to be a $650 million investment. But here's what's occurring. When I was mayor of the city of Detroit, before our election, and there's 24 of us running to become mayor of the city of Detroit, the market share or affirmative action program that the Mayor Young had, my predecessor had, was struck down because of Richmond versus Croson. It's an affirmative action case. And my corporation counsel, Phyllis James, came up with a race-neutral approach of requiring our city departments to do 30% of their purchase with Detroit-based businesses. Because of the angst between the business community and Mayor Young, my predecessor, the last 4 years that he was in office for 20, many of the businesses moved outside the city. So guess who was in the city? Businesses of color. And so the businesses of color were able to come in and help build, because the businesses decided that when we built 2 new stadiums for the Lions, and for the Tigers, they said we're going to adopt Executive Order 4. When CompuWare moved from, which is a high-tech company, moved from Farmington into the city, they said the same thing. The 3 casinos that moved downtown that were building downtown, they adopted the same approach. Chris Ellis, now this is after it's all done, is saying we're going to do the same thing. And so he's got joint ventures and things going on. He's made it very clear that he wants people of color working, by the way, in building the stadium and building the housing, commercial, etc. Then I want you to, let me just digress for a moment since race has come up. Here's what I want you all to understand. Back in 1982-83, social scientists and demographers started writing about a phenomenon that they labeled the browning of America. Their prediction was based on birth rate and based upon the relaxation of immigration rules that by 2056, the majority of people living in the United States would be people of color, and that the Hispanic community would be the largest single ethnic minority group. Now that was at a time, 82, 83, when African Americans had more people living in the United States than did the Hispanic community. 2003, the Census Department said that the Hispanic community now is the largest single ethnic minority group in the United States. And that the African American, that was at 13.2%, African American 12.6, 12.7. In 2004, the Census Department said that the Hispanic and Asian community was going to triple in size by 2050. And then by 2050, the non-white Hispanic group would be 50.1%, thus starting to confirm what was written in 82, 83. Then in 2008, the Census Department said that because of birth rate, because of the other issues that are there, somewhere between 2035 and 2042, the majority of people living in the United States of America were going to be people of color. And then in 2011, they said somewhere between 2015 and 2019, the majority of people living in the United States of America, 18 years of age and younger, were going to be people of color. Today in America, the majority of babies born every day are babies of color. Now, what does all that mean to business? Well, guess what? If you've got an emerging population with discretionary funds to spend, cars, clothing, where you shop, your hotels, etc., where you go, business wants their market share. There is a group, how many of you have heard of the the $1 billion roundtable? The $1 billion roundtable are those corporations in the United States, and one of the boards that I served on, I aged off this past year in December. Johnson Controls is one of them. But there are now 22 businesses that do $1 billion a year or more with businesses of color and women. Walmart, for example, and I did some consulting work for Walmart. Walmart does a direct spend of $4.2 billion. They have an effective spend of another $4 billion. And you've got Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, Toyota, and so. Well, what does all that mean? It means, like Chris Illich is no fool. If you want a business to succeed, you need to have access so that you can earn the respect and the brand loyalty to your business. And by the way, guys, I don't want to break your face, but I want you to know before the crisis came up, 2008, women-owned businesses accounted for $1.92 trillion in sales. Women accounted for 82 to 85% of all consumer purchases. You watch what's going on in corporate America today with women rising to the top as CEOs and the like. It's going to make a difference.
Yeah, Mayor, I don't want to cut you off completely because I think we can come back to some of these themes, but I'm just watching the clock a little bit, so I want to make sure that we open up and I'm sure people may ask about some of these issues as well, but I want to make sure we...
Final point.
Sure.
I've joined Chantil, that is to say I'm concerned about education in the city of Detroit and what will take place going forward. I think anybody worth their salt is going to be afraid to have a negative image on them and not fulfilling the expectations that Jim and others work with. And they're going to be more conscientious about the budgets that they put together. Because before, council was presented with budgets that was going to sell the interest that the city of Detroit had in the tunnel going between Windsor and Detroit, and it was going to be income of $75 million coming in to the city of Detroit. It never even saw the light of day. And so unrealistic budgets, I don't think you're going to see those again.
That'll be very interesting to see how long the spotlight, also the national spotlight, stays on Detroit, which I'm sure will affect it as well. So
at least the tunnel for another 40 years. So that will come up.
I just open it up to questions of folks.
40 years.
Yes, I'm back.
I want to go back to unions for a moment, and you mentioned that unions have been very beneficial for Detroit, and you said that without unions, Detroit would be in a lot worse position. It seems like the opposite is true. The top 10 cities in the U.S. with the lowest unemployment rate are all non-unionized cities with right to work and right to work states. In addition, it seems like all the foreign automakers that are blowing GM and Ford out of the water are all companies that have moved their plants south to non-unionized states and are in non-unionized territories. So, I mean, just looking at the picture behind you and looking at the bankruptcy and all the problems that Detroit has going through, I mean, how can you make the claim that unionized labor has benefited Detroit?
Because I've lived through it and I've seen it, and so I'm not talking about something that somebody's read. I've watched it. But I would also make this observation, and you're absolutely correct, as it relates to the transplants, as they're sometimes referred to, but they create great jobs in the United States, and they build outstanding vehicles, whether they happen to be in Alabama or wherever the case may be, or South Carolina. But there are changes that are starting to take place. Now, I will also tell you that the unions can shoot themselves in the foot. Here's what I mean by that. Governor Snyder, when he first got elected, there was a demand by the Republican legislature, both House and Senate, that they pass a right-to-work legislation in Michigan. The governor said, I don't want to do that because I don't want to create, we got too much on our plate to be dealing with anxiety and anger and frustration, etc. And so he took a big hit by his party. The unions, on the other hand, decided, well, you know, I think we ought to have a constitutional amendment. And so they put it on the ballot that would ensure that they don't have a right-to-work legislation in Michigan. And wouldn't you know that it did not pass? Now, it's like if you were looking at a bear, if you're going to shoot it, you better kill it, because if you don't kill it, it will come back. And so they missed, and the legislature, with the governor's assent, passed a right-to-work initiative in the state of Michigan. So I'm not saying that they're pure, and I'm not saying that they're perfect. I'm just simply saying that changes have been made, and it's coming. And if you heard Chantel saying that because there's no way to compensate in the same manner as you might a company that's making widgets or whatever the case may be, that you can give bonuses. The city gave, as all cities have. And if you think we're a little nuts, why don't you take a look at, just by way of, as an aside, what's occurring in Chicago. Not only in Chicago, but the state of Illinois and the challenges. And then in Florida, as I read in the papers, there's a number of cities in Florida that are dealing with challenges of pensions. It's something that at the end of the day we're going to work through. It's not perfect, but I'm just simply saying, and the reason why I brought up the issues that I brought up is that I don't want you all walking out of here thinking that unions are bad. You've got to be able to balance it, and you make your own decision and choices.
If I could just add to that, I think it's important to understand the history of labor and unions in this country, the philosophy behind unions and the protections that they created for everyone when people were dying, literally going to work and dying on the lines. People were losing limbs and they were like, all right, get back to work. Unions created safe work environments. Unions created a living wage and for our country that made a better quality of life for everybody. Are they perfect? Absolutely not. But if you look at the history of unions, it's important. And I know in the context of Detroit, I sometimes sound anti-labor because I think that the pendulum swung too far for us and we didn't change. We were not as nimble as we should have been. But it's also important to understand the positive impacts that unions have had all over this nation, including in right-to-work states.
I did want to follow up, though. It seems like you mentioned Chicago and some of the other places that are having the problems, but that seems to prove my point, that the states that are unionized, that do have these overbearing liabilities and entitlements, are the ones with all the problems. But then we looked at somewhere like Dallas, Texas, or Phoenix, Arizona, where there's almost no pensions and there's no unionized labor, and those states are doing great. And to your point, they're not shooting their workers in the foot, they're not torturing their workers, they're not making them, work unethical hours. They're all fine. Everyone, it seems like all these non-unionized states are just working out just fine, and for the most part, much better than the unionized ones.
And to your point, not only that, but you see there's been, I think, at least 5 states that Michigan has passed right to work. And so these are issues that come up, and citizens in the states in which have that issue before them can vote one way or the other. And that's what life is about. That's democracy.
I think a cynical answer, though, to your question was just give them some time, okay? Because the reality is that is it the unionization that's the problem, or is it the fact that it's the age of the city itself, the amount of retirees that have built up, and Florida, listen, the tree may grow to the sky, but Florida, Arizona, all these places are growing so that the percentage of the budget that is absorbed by legacy costs, by OPEB and other costs are minimal. Now, the good thing is in many of these states, they're going to bypass defined benefit retirement schemes and going to have defined contribution schemes which decouple the economic risk of the retirement funding from the city's budget, and that may bode very well for them. But other Sun Belt municipalities are still dealing with issues. I can, Glendale, Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona, all have their challenges, and I've spoken to these other municipalities, as well. I guess the caveat that I would add, listen, the reality, unionization of municipal workforces and state workforces is here to stay. Like that's not changing.
And that's part of where we are in America. And as it is the creation of pensions and the creation of those benefit pensions is not being a gift, but being a constitutional right, is to a degree here to stay too. That hasn't changed. That's not going to change either. So this is the architecture that we have to work with. What we were able to so you have to work with that architecture to solve problems. And one thing that happened in Detroit to solve a problem using that architecture is we basically said, listen, the city can't afford these healthcare promises anymore. So what we did is, and we wouldn't be able to do it without without an organized retiree group and labor group, is we created these voluntary employee benefit associations, which have also been used in big autos, called VBAs. We capitalized those VBAs with the restructured debt from the city, so they'll get paid interest and principal over time. And those VBAs are going to be run by labor representatives, and those VBAs are going to be in charge of subsidizing and acquiring health care policies for for retirees as opposed to the city. And we took advantage of the fact that we did have an organized group that had leadership. And we said, listen, if you want this to work for, in the future, you're going to have to take the economic risk and you're going to have to be in charge of it.
Other questions? Yes?
I wanted to say, can you guys hear me anyway? I don't know. Do I need this?
It's not working, I don't think.
Thanks for the video.
Okay. It's for posterity.
There we go.
It's
right,
also for people who don't hear so well, so you'll learn about that.
This is primarily directed at Chantil and Garrett. I'm curious about, we learned that capital is mobile, that jobs can go overseas, and then we learned that people are mobile. People can leave Detroit, people can choose a different city, and as that occurs, the interest payment per citizen living there starts to balloon, and we have these vicious cycles. And I'm wondering, either in a stabilized or in a decreasing population type of scenario, where do you see the biggest opportunities to head off these crises before they occur, just in terms of population? And do we need a way for the government to guarantee pensions for certain areas, just the way that large corporations, there's pension guarantees sometimes if the corporation fails? I'm just curious, where do you guys see the opportunities there or the risks there, and how do we confront that going forward?
I don't know that there's any way to guarantee the stabilization of a population other than you're offering a better product. I mean, for municipalities, it's the same as in a business, except the product we offer is services. So we need to offer, a school system. We need to offer city services that could rival the services and the opportunities in other municipalities. It's what attracted people to Detroit in the first place. And in order to stabilize and keep them there, we'll have to do the same thing. As it relates to pensions, I think Michigan was the only place where there was a municipal bankruptcy, and correct me if I'm wrong, where in our state constitution, the pensions were guaranteed. So even in a place where technically pensions are guaranteed, the financial reality is what it is. And so it's the responsibility of the folks who are there creating policy to make sure that you're keeping up with those financial realities and making decisions accordingly. But I don't know that there are ever any guarantees in anything.
Sure. So just offer that.
Yeah.
That's entirely reasonable.
Do you want to weigh in on that?
No, I think one of the principles I want to hold to is not everything has been said. Everything has been said, but not everybody said it. So I won't.
More questions? Yes.
So this is for Councilwoman Jenkins. I realized preparing for this that I've never actually been to Detroit. I've spent a lot of time in the Detroit metro area. And so the 700,000 residents of Detroit are only about 20% of the metropolitan area's population. To what extent do the other municipalities that surround Detroit benefit from Detroit's Institute of Arts and not pay into this system and sort of free ride on the city?
And, well, just recently, actually, legislation was passed where now other municipalities are contributing to the DIA in a way that they had not before. But certainly if you talk to residents, there was this argument, and this was a part of the argument during the bankruptcy, was that the DIA was an asset for the suburbanites. This wasn't a city asset. This was something that people outside of the city came into the city to enjoy, and then they went home. So there was a lot of conversation about that. But one of the things that has come out of this is, whereas when resources were plentiful in Michigan, and every municipality, township, village thought they could survive on their own, and Detroit, we didn't need Detroit, Detroit didn't need them. Now we realize that we're all tied at the hip, because the things that impacted us impacted some of the most affluent cities and villages in the state of Michigan. So we're getting along in a way that we probably would not have if this crisis hadn't occurred.
I might add that the Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb counties and municipalities they're in also support a tax for the Detroit Zoo and then for the DIA. And there has been a remarkable working relationship between the city and the suburbs that is still ongoing today.
I would say it's maybe only 2 to 3 decades behind where it should. I mean, it is improving, and it's the path forward. You know, the deals that we cut on the water system. It was a fractious political process to get the millage for the DIA, but it's the way future. One of the reasons Detroit got to the place it was is that it was suburb versus city, black versus white. Where's the manufacturing? Where's the wealth? Who gets what? Let's divide it all up. And that existed for far too long in the Detroit and Southeast Michigan, and it existed in a way that other cities and other metropolitan areas got past it for whatever reason, right? Pittsburgh got past it. Philadelphia got past it. Baltimore got past it. They found a way, Charlotte got past it, and got past it to the point of more shared resources, more combined services, and the recognition that their economic future is more integrated, right? You still have Oakland County, through all the cooperation, still fighting the M1 line, making it all the way up past 8 Mile, right? When the reality is that's where the future should be. The future should be of these entities working more closely together. So that, hopefully, Detroit and Michigan are not a recidivist when it comes to this, and they can follow what we're seeing elsewhere throughout the United States, which is a recognition that entities need to combine resources, they need to find efficiencies, and they need to collaborate, to create centers where people want to, and they're able to go and commute and live.
Yes.
Here's a.
Hold on a minute, Dave. We got to get the mic, even for you.
Okay.
Especially.
So here's a political and joint political and finance question, so everybody can handle whatever piece they want on Chicago. So, what's your scorecard for Mayor Emanuel? I guess your advice for Mayor Emanuel, and in light of all that situation, do you believe that Illinois is an A- or Chicago is an A- credit?
Correct. Yeah.
Whoever wants to.
You can start with the credit.
Okay. Chicago, Chicago has many of the same issues that Detroit has, in that it has a strong labor legacy, and it has an extraordinary and continuing to grow retiree benefit obligation on top of its citizenry, and that's both the city's pensions, the public schools pensions, the city transit authorities pensions, the Cook County's pensions, and then the state's pensions. It's a staggering element, and probably was maybe covered last year when you guys focused on pensions. And I think that Rom gets a middling to good report card on his first 4 years, because he did begin to attempt to address issues that were going on inside the city and correcting with decades of running these deficits, and he spread the message that don't always trust that your retiree benefits are going to be there. Something's going to come. You gotta start getting ready for it. We'll see in his next 4 years, now that he's been reelected, where the rubber hits the road, and what sort of changes he can make in a state that doesn't have as friendly a legislature towards reform, a governor that is willing to reform but has substantially less gubernatorial power to execute reform, but to his benefit, in a much more vibrant municipality that can afford sort of a tax rate. So it's not going 9, because you don't get to that breaking point, but it's going to be a costly and fractious process that they're going to have to work through over time. Does the city and the state still deserve the credit rating that they have? I think it most likely doesn't, but credit ratings all take a while to go down, just like they take a while to go up. But there's a tremendous Chicago is a tremendous economic engine that is much more akin to I would go back to New York 70s style sort of. It's a place where people want to go. It can take a hit. There may be other ways to get resources into it, and so it's not something that the rating agencies are willing just to sort of dump out to. And the last point on that is, I think the rating agencies are very conscious now of the implications of their changes in ratings as they focused on Chicago, and they focused on the decision finally to push Puerto Rico into junk status, and that weighs on their role in the public dialogue. Right.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, it does.
I worked with Rahm Emanuel when he worked for the Clinton Gore administration. He is a remarkably brilliant guy. And when he decided to step down as the chief of staff for President Obama and run for the office of mayor, when Richard Daley decided he was not going to run again, I thought it would be a great opportunity for the city of Chicago, and I still believe that. And I think we will be able to work with any of the groups, organizations, entities that have to be worked with to solve the problem. Chicago did not have the enormous problems that the city of Detroit had, unemployment and a lot of people leaving the city. But he took on the thing that he and his predecessor, Richard Daley, felt was awfully important, because they looked at other cities and saw what was current, as did Tom Menino when Tom was mayor of Boston, and that is the issue of education. And in taking on education, he took on the unions. And so he made that very clear. And one of the reasons why he had to run off, obviously, was because the unions lined up, most of them, the bigger unions lined up through their leadership, starting with the teachers, against him. But there were a number of other unions who supported him, unions that engaged in building and other kinds of their areas. And so I believe that he and the governor and the legislature are going to have to work it through. What also inherited was in January 1 of this year, in an effort to continue to push things down the pipeline, there was a new tax that was imposed, or increase that was imposed in the pension plan that started this year that he inherited. It wasn't something he promoted, it was done before him. So he's got to be able to work with that to improve city services and to provide the kind of thing. And when you think about it, when you describe the person who's a widow, and the impact and the loss, and I thought it was a great job that you all worked out, and that Judge Rosen and his group in working out the grand design or grand bargain. The union, the membership, or folks on the pension, they lost 4.5%. Before, they were talking about 20% or higher in terms of pension loss, in terms of receiving it. So they worked through a lot of different kinds of things. But you've got real people who, they may clean your house, they may do a number of other kind of things. These are real people who want to go to the grocery store, want to be able to buy food, want to be able to put something on the table. And the loss is not something you just read and say, isn't that nice, and you bypass it. I mean, if you're able to do that, then I suggest you need to really sort of get in touch with your soul, because these are people who have challenges. So it's not something that you can just put on the table and say you do it. It's something you have to work through so that everybody can grow. I mean, businesses need to succeed. That's how our country remains strong. But we've got to be able to work through it. And my money is betting on Rahm Emanuel.
Other questions? Yeah.
This is more something I worry about.
Before you worry too much, you need to microphone.
Thank you, Mayor. As a capital markets guy, I worry about elected leaders not understanding the limits of capital markets and not having enough respect for the fact that the capital markets price issues related to supply and demand. And I'd like to go back to an earlier thought that I've had in each course, which is, if we took a look at financial literacy generally in our country, I just make an observation that the level of financial literacy is abysmal. And I'd like to see, because I ask each of my classes, did you get a course in high school on personal financial economics? And with one exception, the answer was no. Did you take a driver's ed course? Most did. I took one. I trade the driver's ed course for a financial literacy course any day of the week. And I think if we can start at the bottom and build some financial literacy into our citizenry, the citizenry is better equipped to make choices at in their elections, and we might have a little more sophistication in terms of how our elected leaders allocate resources. And lastly, I'd like to see the leaders of the biggest corporations in this country reach out to the mayors and to the governors in a way that I've never seen happen. Because I think until that happens, it's still a we versus they, and I don't see it as very productive.
Let me just indicate a couple of things. There's absolutely no class in any university or college or community college that I know of that says, do you want to be mayor or city council? If you do, take these classes. And so here's the classes that you take, and here's the grades that you receive, so that when you present yourself before the public and say, well, what did you get in? I want to be mayor 601. And the other thing that I would suggest is that I think it's absolutely important for you all to consider as you move into your professional careers that at some point you might want to think about giving back to your community. Whether that means running for a state legislative office or Congress or president or for mayor or governor. Because you ask who has that knowledge base, well, you've got a room full of people right here who've got that knowledge base and will be even brighter as they go through their respective careers. And I think it's important for that to occur. In the meantime, for those of us who do not have the acumen that you and others have, you better make sure that you get the absolute best financial director that you can get to come in and work. But please remember, while you're trying to get somebody to come in to be a budget director or finance director, a city doesn't have the same kind of money as corporate America, can't give out bonuses and the like. So you depend upon each other to provide that information. And you also need people with integrity that will follow good quality, absolute advice and not to get people elected in terms of going in and looking for something that can best suit them. And by the way, until you start running, when they have the candidates night, you might want to show up at your local candidates night for somebody running for mayor, wherever you all happen to be, or governor, et cetera, whatever state that you go to practice your profession, and ask the questions of the candidate. Well, tell me, what do you think about doing so-and-so?
You bet.
Et cetera. Those are the kinds of things that can self-help. But I also will tell you somebody else who's one of my heroes, and that's Mayor Bloomberg. You think about what he did and the like. You can say, yeah, he can afford to do it, but yeah, he didn't have to do it, but he did it. And put his own money there to make a difference in the life of New York. And it's made a difference.
I'll speak to the second part of your concern, which as I understand it is a wish that there would be greater relationships, stronger relationships and between mayors, governors, et cetera, and CEOs of corporations. And I want to make a suggestion that I think really is borne out by the facts about where our politics are today. And one of the ways that I express it is that I am, in the short term, a pessimist about politics in America. Don't ask me to say what span of time is, but I am short-term a pessimist. The kind of politics that we see playing out every day in Congress is with us for some significant period of time, barring an invasion from one of those other galaxies. 85% of the seats in the House of Representatives are safe districts, which means that 85% of the people who represent us in Congress only have to listen to 50% of the people who live in their district. And they don't really listen to 50%. They listen to a much smaller percentage. They listen to the folks that vote in primaries. So if you wonder why we have this puerile polarization in American politics today, that's it. If you ask how did it get that way, it's a longer conversation. Some of it has to do with redistricting. More of it has to do with how we as a nation have been engaged in our own migration patterns around the country during the last 4 to 5 decades. But here's the point. Long term, I'm an optimist. And the reason that I'm an optimist is less that I think it's going to start changing in Washington, although I hope it might. It's that there are abundant examples, and you've just spent 2.5 hours listening to one of the stories, about what can happen in governance when people at the local level, whether they're forced to or they decide to, can make things happen. Sometimes this phenomenon is called the new federalism. But the more important point of it is that there is, and there are innumerable examples of a sort of bottom-up approach in American politics, where the CEOs of corporations, the heads of unions, the presidents of colleges and universities, et cetera, are working with their mayors, their county executives, or their governors to get things done because they realize it isn't getting done in Washington. There are countless examples. Some of these are done on an individual community basis. Some of these are done on a regional basis where, for example, the New England states or the Great Lakes states have created consortia to deal with specific issues, whether it's water or pollution or you name it. So and of course I share the mayor's point about giving back and running for public office. The difference, I have a difference of opinion with the mayor and Chantel on that, which is they got elected and I didn't. But I did try. And you know, there's nothing, the reason that I was so interested in running for mayor of Denver was because having been involved in politics and being involved in campaigns for people who were in the House or in the Senate or governors, the thing that I understood is mayors can really get something done. And the first thing they better get done is pick up the trash and plow the streets. But the point is, coming back to Professor Förster's question, I really think we are already seeing it, and over the long haul, I like to think that the best days of this country lie ahead of us as we begin to reformulate what the federalism concept really is, and that it's not all up here, but that it's down here in communities that have to make things work, in states that have to have balanced budgets, and you know, that's where people live.
Garrett, thank you. I think that's a great introduction to our closing statements by each of the panelists. And I thought maybe, rather than just sort of an open-ended statement, that you might try to tackle this question to bring us back to Detroit. And that is, even though history is not fully written whether or not Detroit is a success, there were many doubters, many skeptics about even entering into this process. And the fact is that the city got in and out of Chapter 9 in almost record time. It was an enormous lift. What made it happen in your view? What were the factors that came together that led to success in this case? It seems like there were a lot of things that could have gone wrong at a lot of different points. But why was there a successful exit of bankruptcy? Jim, why don't you start us off with that idea?
Sure. So while I formulate a thought on that, I hope this comes back to you because Matt, you've been asking a lot of questions of us. But the reality is that Matt has had such a tremendous opportunity and has tremendous perspective on Southeast Michigan and in covering the automotive crisis, and then having all that knowledge of how government and business could work together and how Southeast Michigan worked together and the federal government came in. He was such the ideal person for the Wall Street Journal, and he was located to cover Detroit and then to pull out of this fractious process, okay, what are the lessons and what are the stories that America wants to read about this? So I'm hoping that we get a couple words from you on this thought as well. there's so much that could have gone wrong in the process and in the strategy that we laid out to get through a restructuring and an emergency manager tenure of 18 months. You know, we don't have to list them, and clearly there were moments of serendipity. We knew there had to be a solution for the art for the DIA. We did not anticipate that philanthropic organizations would step up to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, that would allow the state to kick in, that would find the solution to the process. But what drove it as fast as it did, and where it differed from the corporate settings that I'm in that still have their own pace, is that the leadership and decision makers, and I'd like to think advisors as well, realized that more than any other process that I've been involved with, this was about lives. You know, this was about this was life and death, not only for the city, but the citizens. You know, and that was felt by the mayors. That was felt certainly by Kevin Orr, the emergency manager, who aged like president while he was there, if you look at the before and after. But that was felt by the mediators, and that was felt by the judge, and he put everybody to task on that. I was commenting to these guys, the creditors' attorneys, you talk, what was their nightmare scenario? Their nightmare scenario was always being up in front of court and arguing why, you know, their client would like an extra, you know, 2 weeks to argue a particular point, or why something wouldn't have to be approved. And basically the judge would put them on the spot and say, listen, you're standing between, you're asking me to hold up turning the lights on. Putting a street light on. How many, you know, how many more crimes are going to have to occur? How many crimes do you think are appropriate to occur so that you can finish your motion? And the attorney has to sit there on the stand, and the press is in the room, and they're like, well, how am I going to respond to that? Because the next thing is going to be like, my client is in favor of crime in Detroit. So stepping back to it, it was the recognition that what had to be done quickly, because Detroit was a melting ice cube, melting faster and faster and faster. We were down to 700. It could be less. The city was vacating. People were walking away from their houses. People were getting shot. The resources weren't there, and it was just going to get worse and worse and worse. And the judge felt that. The governor felt that. The mediators felt that. So there was an urgency that drove everybody forward, and an understanding from the amongst the advisors, certainly on the city side, that there was failure was simply not an alternative.
Yeah.
And
you might want to, I mean, just for those that don't know, the 18-month window was tied to the emergency manager law, so that at the end of 18 months, the city council would have had a yay or nay vote on continuing with that emergency manager. So, so certainly there was a deadline too, but I think all the points you raised are fantastic. Let me turn now to Santil a little bit about that same issue, because I imagine that when people were talking about consent agreement, emergency manager, Chapter 9, a lot of people thought this is not going to end well for Detroit. Why did it, relatively, at least now, in the perspective that we have, why did it end well in your mind?
Well, I think Jim touched on it. The people who were involved understood the importance of it. I think that Judge Rhodes was the best thing that could have happened for this bankruptcy as it relates to judges that could have been picked. And I think that he was a fantastic shepherd to get everybody through this process. I think that Kevin Orr, you know, my joke with Kevin Orr was, he was the scene in Argo where they said, this is a bad idea, don't you have anything else? Well, they were all bad ideas. Is this the best of the bad ideas? As much as the people hated the idea of an emergency manager, he was the best of the bad ideas we could have gotten. So we had a lot of really good people who were at the table and who understood the importance of getting this done. And they understood that there were literally lives on the line. So people stepped up, people were courageous. Our governor should also get lots of credit for being courageous in a way that past governors were not. Democratic governors, Republican governors, nobody had been brave enough to say we have to take on this issue in Detroit and we've got to find a way to fix it. So it was all the players in the room at the time being committed to making it work. And
I think you raise a great point about political courage. I talked to advisors of the governor before even a consent agreement was broached with the city, who said getting into Detroit, even though it's the largest city in the state and in financial distress, would be political quicksand, and that he should stay out if he has national aspirations, if he wants to be reelected as governor. Tackling Detroit was not the way to find a road to political success, but as we know, he chose it. But Mayor, why don't you join this conversation?
Before you ask me,
yeah.
I join with Jim.
Okay.
I'd now like to hear what you've got to say about your observations. Then I will answer your question.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I wrote a piece after, around the time that the bankruptcy was finishing up, and I think for our readers, we were trying to figure out and present evidence to this fact of whether or not Detroit was sort of an alarm bell for the rest of the country and the rest of the world to figure out what was happening in Detroit. Should other people be concerned? Were there suggestions for change, a model for reform in other places? Or is what happened in Detroit sort of a one-off? Are there too many extraordinary circumstances that made Detroit really so unique that there are limited lessons to be learned?